Our first story comes from someone who discovered something disturbing about their roommate's daily routine. I've been living with my roommate David for about 8 months now, and I thought I knew everything about his habits. He's clean, pays rent on time, and generally keeps to himself. But last week I discovered something that's been keeping me up at night. David works from home as a freelance graphic designer, so he's usually in his room most of the day. I work a regular 9 to 5, so our schedules don't overlap much, except for evenings and weekends. Recently, I've been working from home more often due to a project deadline, which meant I was around during David's usual work hours. That's when I started noticing the voices. At first I thought he was just on video calls with clients or having phone meetings. The voices would start around 10 in the morning and continue intermittently throughout the day. But something felt off about the conversations. They were too animated, too emotional for business calls. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I pressed my ear against the wall that separates our rooms and listened carefully. What I heard made my blood run cold. David was having full conversations with multiple people, but the voices were all his own. He was changing his voice, his accent, even his personality to play different characters. He'd spend hours talking to these imaginary people, discussing their problems, their relationships, their daily lives. The most disturbing part was how detailed these conversations were. He had created entire backstories for each character. There was Margaret, an elderly woman who worried about her grandchildren. There was Tommy, a young boy excited about starting school. There was Catherine, a middle-aged woman going through a divorce. David would switch between these characters seamlessly, responding to himself as if he were having real conversations with real people. He'd comfort Margaret about her health concerns, encourage Tommy about making friends, and give Catherine relationship advice. I started documenting these conversations, writing down the characters and their storylines. Over the course of a week, I counted at least 12 distinct personalities that David regularly spoke with. Each had their own voice, their own problems, and their own relationship with him. The strangest part was how normal David seemed when we interacted. He'd emerge from his room for dinner, make small talk about his work, and act completely ordinary. There was no indication that he'd spent the entire day having elaborate conversations with people who didn't exist. I confronted him about it last night. I asked him directly about the voices I'd been hearing from his room. David went completely pale and started stuttering. He tried to claim he was practicing for voice acting jobs, but when I mentioned specific character names and storylines, he broke down. He admitted that he'd been creating these imaginary relationships for over 2 years. He said it started during the pandemic, when he was feeling isolated and lonely. What began as simple self-talk evolved into these complex, ongoing relationships with fictional people. David explained that these characters had become more real to him than most of his actual relationships. He knew their favourite foods, their childhood memories, their fears and dreams. He'd even created photo albums and social media profiles for some of them. The most concerning part was when he told me that sometimes he forgot they weren't real. He'd catch himself buying Christmas presents for Margaret or worrying about Tommy's first day of school, as if these were actual people in his life. He's been seeing a therapist now, trying to understand why he created this elaborate fantasy world. But he's also terrified of giving up these relationships because they've become such a central part of his life. He spends more time talking to his imaginary friends than he does interacting with real people. I don't know what to do with this information. David isn't dangerous, and he's not hurting anyone except possibly himself. But living with someone who maintains detailed relationships with a dozen fictional people is unsettling in ways I can't fully explain. That story ends there. The level of detail and emotional investment this person puts into imaginary relationships is genuinely concerning. It's like he created an entire alternate reality populated with people who exist only in his mind. The fact that he sometimes forgets they're not real suggests this goes way beyond simple loneliness into something much more serious. I hope he gets the help he needs, But I can't imagine how strange it must be to live with someone carrying on that elaborate of a fantasy life. Let's move on to our next story, which comes from someone who made a discovery about their neighbour that changed everything. I live in a quiet suburban neighbourhood where everyone minds their own business. My next-door neighbour, Patricia, is a retired teacher in her 70s who keeps to herself but always waves when we pass on the street. She has this beautiful garden that she tends to every morning, and her house is always immaculate. About 3 months ago, I started noticing that Patricia was getting a lot of packages delivered. At first, I didn't think much of it because everyone shops online these days, but the deliveries became constant, sometimes 3 or 4 packages a day from different companies. The weird part was that Patricia never seemed to bring the packages inside. I'd see them sitting on her porch for hours, sometimes overnight. When they finally disappeared, I assumed she was just slow getting to them. Then I started noticing people coming to her house at odd hours. Not friends or family members, but strangers who would knock on her door, exchange a few words with Patricia, and leave carrying packages. This happened several times a week, always different people. My curiosity got the better of me, so I started paying closer attention to Patricia's routine. That's when I discovered something that completely changed my perception of this sweet elderly woman. Patricia was running a sophisticated package theft operation. She had somehow figured out how to intercept packages that were supposed to be delivered to other addresses in our neighbourhood. I'm not sure if she was bribing delivery drivers or if she had some other method, but packages meant for houses 3 or 4 streets away were ending up on her porch. The people coming to her house weren't random visitors, they were customers. Patricia was selling stolen packages to people who knew they were buying items that had been taken from other people's deliveries. I watched this operation for weeks, documenting everything I saw. Patricia had turned package theft into a full-time business. She was systematic about it, keeping detailed records of what she had available and scheduling appointments with her buyers. The most disturbing part was how normal she acted about it. She'd tend to her garden in the morning, sort through stolen packages in the afternoon, and meet with customers in the evening. Then she'd wave at neighbours and chat about the weather, as if she wasn't running a criminal enterprise out of her house. I realised that dozens of neighbours had probably been wondering where their packages were, never suspecting that the sweet old lady next door was stealing them. People were missing birthday gifts, medication, important documents. Also, Patricia could make a few extra dollars in retirement. When I finally reported her to the police, they were initially sceptical. Patricia looked like everyone's ideal grandmother, not a career criminal, but when they investigated, they found her house filled with stolen packages and detailed records of her sales. It turned out Patricia had been doing this for over a year and had stolen hundreds of packages worth thousands of dollars. She had a whole network of buyers who knew exactly what they were purchasing. Some people were even placing special requests for specific types of items. Patricia was arrested last week, and the story made the local news. Neighbours are still in shock that someone we all trusted was systematically stealing from us. The investigation revealed that she'd stolen everything from baby formula to prescription medications to expensive electronics. The saddest part is that Patricia didn't seem to need the money. She had a comfortable pension and owned her house outright. When asked why she did it, she told police that she was bored in retirement and enjoyed the challenge of running a business, even if it was illegal. Now, every time I see a package sitting on someone's porch, I wonder if there are other Patricias in the neighbourhood, sweet-looking people running criminal operations right under our noses. That story is over. The image of this grandmother systematically stealing packages while maintaining her perfect neighbour facade is genuinely disturbing. It's terrifying how someone can live a completely double life like that, being friendly and trustworthy to your face while actively stealing from you behind your back. The fact that she did it out of boredom rather than necessity makes it even more unsettling. Sometimes the people who seem the most harmless are hiding the darkest secrets. Our next confession comes from someone who discovered their family had been keeping a massive secret for decades. I'm 28 years old, and I just found out that my entire family has been lying to me about something fundamental for my entire life. This discovery has shattered everything I thought I knew about my identity and my family's history. Growing up, my parents always told me that my grandparents on my father's side had died in a car accident when I was too young to remember them. They said it was too painful to talk about, which is why we never visited their graves or kept photos of them around the house. I accepted this explanation and never questioned it. My mother's parents were very much alive and part of my life, so I didn't feel like I was missing anything significant. Occasionally, I'd ask about my father's side of the family, but the conversations would always get shut down quickly with comments about how talking about the dead was too difficult. Last month, I was helping my parents clean out their attic when I found a box of documents that had been hidden behind some old furniture. The box contained birth certificates, marriage licenses, and other official papers dating back several generations. As I looked through these documents, I found something that made no sense. There were recent utility bills and bank statements with my grandfather's name on them, dated from just 2 years ago. According to my parents, he'd been dead for over 25 years. I confronted my parents about these documents, and after hours of denying and deflecting, they finally told me the truth. My grandparents aren't dead. They're very much alive and living about 3 hours away from us. The reason my parents cut contact with them wasn't because of death, it was because of money. When I was 3 years old, my grandparents loaned my parents a significant amount of money to buy their house. The agreement was that my parents would pay it back over 10 years with reasonable interest, but my parents never made a single payment. Instead, they moved to a different state and cut off all contact with my grandparents. They changed their phone numbers, didn't leave forwarding addresses, and essentially disappeared from my grandparents' lives. My grandparents tried to find us for years. They hired private investigators, sent letters to old addresses, and even tried to contact us through mutual friends. But my parents had covered their tracks well and managed to avoid being found. The most heartbreaking part was learning that my grandparents had been trying to maintain a relationship with me, specifically. They'd sent birthday cards and Christmas presents to our old address for years, hoping they might eventually reach me. They'd saved money for my college education and had been holding on to photo albums and keepsakes they wanted to share with me. When I asked my parents why they'd stolen from family and then disappeared, they claimed my grandparents were controlling and difficult to deal with. But when I pressed for specific examples, they couldn't provide any. It became clear that they'd simply decided it was easier to disappear than to pay back the money they owed. The worst part was realizing that my grandparents had no idea if I was alive, healthy, or happy. They'd missed my entire childhood, my graduation, my wedding, everything, because my parents were too cowardly to face their financial obligations. I tracked down my grandparents' current address and called them last week. The conversation was emotional and difficult. They cried when they heard my voice and told me they'd never stopped hoping they'd find me someday. They're both in their 80s now and in poor health. My grandfather has Alzheimer's disease and doesn't always remember things clearly, but my grandmother is sharp and has kept detailed records of everything that happened. She showed me copies of the loan agreement, documentation of their attempts to find us, and boxes of letters and gifts they'd bought for me over the years. I've been visiting them every weekend since we reconnected. My grandmother has been showing me photo albums from my father's childhood and sharing stories about our family history that I'd never heard. My grandfather has moments of clarity where he recognizes me and talks about how much I look like my father did. At my age, my parents are furious that I've reconnected with my grandparents. They claim I'm being manipulated and that I don't understand how difficult the situation was back then. They've threatened to cut contact with me if I continue seeing my grandparents, but I don't care anymore. I'm helping my grandparents pursue legal action to recover the money my parents stole from them. It's a complicated case because of how much time has passed, but we have all the documentation and evidence needed to prove what happened. The saddest part is realizing how much time we've lost. My grandmother keeps saying she wishes she could have been there for my childhood, and I wish I could have known them before my grandfather's memory started failing. My parents robbed all of us of decades of family relationships because they were too selfish to pay back money they'd borrowed. That story comes to an end here. The level of selfishness required to steal from your own parents and then disappear with their grandchild is absolutely staggering. These people literally faked deaths to avoid paying back a loan and robbed their child of relationships with loving grandparents. The fact that the grandparents kept sending gifts and saving money for college shows the kind of people they really are. Sometimes the family members you trust most are the ones capable of the most devastating betrayals. Let's transition to another confession that involves a different kind of family deception. My wife has been pretending to have a job for the past 2 years, and I just discovered the truth by accident. I've been married to Lisa for 6 years, and I thought I knew everything about her. She's always been ambitious and career-focused, which is one of the things I love about her. 2 years ago, she told me she got a promotion at her marketing firm that required her to work remotely full-time. I was happy for her because she seemed excited about the new role and the salary increase. Lisa has always been the primary breadwinner in our relationship. I work as a freelance writer, so my income is inconsistent, while she brought in a steady paycheck that covered most of our expenses. When she got this supposed promotion, she said her salary had increased significantly, which explained why we suddenly had more money for vacations and home improvements. Every morning, Lisa would get dressed in business attire, grab her laptop bag, and leave the house around 8:30. She'd come home around 6 in the evening, looking appropriately tired from a day at the office. She'd talk about meetings, difficult clients, and office politics just like any other working professional. The charade was so convincing that I never questioned it. She had answers for everything, detailed stories about co-workers, complaints about her boss, excitement about upcoming projects. She even showed me emails on her phone occasionally, though I never looked too closely at them. About 3 weeks ago, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Sandra, who used to work with Lisa at the marketing firm. I hadn't seen Sandra in years, so we caught up for a few minutes. I mentioned how well Lisa was doing with her remote position, and Sandra looked confused. Sandra told me that Lisa had been laid off from the company over 2 years ago during a round of budget cuts. She said it had been a big surprise because Lisa was a good employee, but the entire remote marketing team had been eliminated. Sandra assumed Lisa had found another job immediately, since she'd never heard from her after the layoffs. I was stunned but tried not to show it. I made some excuse about Lisa working for a different company now, and ended the conversation as quickly as possible. But my mind was racing with questions about what Lisa had actually been doing every day for the past 2 years. That evening, I casually asked Lisa about her day at work, listening more carefully to her responses. The stories she told seemed generic and vague, lacking the specific details that real workplace experiences usually have. She mentioned meetings and deadlines, but never anything concrete or verifiable. I decided to follow her the next morning to see where she was actually going. I felt terrible about spying on my wife, but I needed to understand what was happening. Lisa left the house at her usual time, and I waited a few minutes before following her in my car. She drove to the public library downtown and went inside carrying her laptop bag. I waited in the parking lot for about an hour, then went inside to see what she was doing. I found her in the quiet section, sitting at a table with her laptop open, working on what appeared to be online courses. I watched from a distance as she took notes, watched video lectures, and completed assignments. It looked like she was studying web design and digital marketing. She spent the entire day there, taking breaks to walk around or grab coffee from the library cafe. When I confronted Lisa that evening, she broke down immediately. She admitted that she'd been lying about having a job for the past 2 years. After being laid off, she'd been too ashamed to tell me the truth, so she pretended to still be employed while secretly living off our savings and credit cards. Lisa explained that she'd been using our savings to maintain the illusion of her salary. She'd been paying our bills with credit cards and moving money around to make it look like regular paychecks were coming in. She'd been spending her days at the library, taking online courses, trying to develop new skills that might help her find another job. The financial situation was worse than I'd imagined. Lisa had accumulated over $40,000 in credit card debt while maintaining this deception. She'd been taking cash advances to pay for our vacations and home improvements, all while I believed we were financially secure. The most heartbreaking part was learning how much she'd been struggling with depression and anxiety about unemployment. She'd been carrying this enormous burden alone, too proud and ashamed to ask for help. She said she kept thinking she'd find another job soon and could fix everything before I found out. Lisa had been applying for jobs sporadically, but her confidence had been shattered by the layoffs and subsequent rejections. She'd convinced herself that she was unemployable and that lying was easier than facing the reality of our situation. She'd been trapped in this deception for so long that she didn't know how to get out of it. We're working through this together now, but it's been incredibly difficult. The trust in our marriage has been severely damaged, and we're facing serious financial problems because of the debt she accumulated. Lisa is seeing a therapist to deal with her depression and anxiety, and she's actively job hunting with my support. The hardest part is understanding how someone I love so much could lie to me every single day for 2 years. She looked me in the eye every evening and told me detailed stories about a job that didn't exist. She let me worry about my own inconsistent income, while hiding the fact that we had no steady income at all. I love Lisa and I want our marriage to work, but I don't know how long it will take to rebuild the trust that's been broken. Every conversation we have now makes me wonder what else she might be hiding from me. The woman I thought I knew so well had been living a completely fabricated life right in front of me. That story ends there. The dedication required to maintain such an elaborate lie for 2 years is honestly staggering. Getting dressed every morning, creating fake work stories, managing finances to hide massive debt, all while your spouse has no clue what's happening. The shame and depression that drove her to this extreme shows how mental health struggles can spiral into deceptions that hurt everyone involved. Sometimes the people we love most are drowning right beside us, and we never even notice. Our next story takes us into territory that makes you question how well you can ever really know someone. I've been secretly recording my therapy sessions for 3 years, and what I discovered has changed everything I thought I knew about mental health treatment. I started seeing Dr. Matthews for anxiety and depression about 3 years ago. He came highly recommended and had excellent reviews online. During our initial consultation, he seemed professional, empathetic, and genuinely interested in helping me work through my issues. The sessions were expensive, but I felt like they were worth it because I seemed to be making progress. Dr. Matthews would give me homework assignments, suggest coping strategies, and help me understand patterns in my thinking that were contributing to my problems. About 6 months into our sessions, I started recording them on my phone. I told myself it was so I could review his advice later and make sure I was implementing his suggestions correctly. I kept the phone hidden in my jacket pocket, and Dr. Matthews never knew I was recording. At first, listening back to the sessions was helpful. I could catch things I'd missed during our conversations and reflect on his insights when I was in a calmer state of mind. But as time went on, I started noticing patterns in his responses that made me uncomfortable. Dr. Matthews would often give me the exact same advice word for word, even when I was discussing completely different problems. He had what seemed like a script of responses that he'd rotate through, regardless of what I was actually telling him about my life. More concerning was how he'd sometimes contradict advice he'd given me in previous sessions. He'd tell me to try one approach to dealing with anxiety, then a few weeks later suggest the complete opposite strategy without acknowledging the contradiction. I started comparing recordings from different sessions and realized that Dr. Matthews wasn't really listening to me at all. He'd ask the same questions in the same order, give the same responses, and assign the same homework, regardless of my progress or changing circumstances. The breaking point came when I noticed that he was browsing social media on his computer during our sessions. I could see the reflection of his screen in a picture frame behind his desk, and he was scrolling through Facebook and Instagram while I was talking about serious personal issues. I decided to test him by telling him a completely fabricated story about a traumatic event that never happened. I made up details about a car accident and described fake symptoms of PTSD. Dr. Matthews responded with his usual generic empathy and assigned me standard homework for trauma recovery. The next week, I told him the story had been completely made up and that I'd never been in any car accident. Instead of addressing why I'd lied or what that might mean for our therapeutic relationship, he just moved on to his next scripted question, as if nothing had happened. I realised that Dr. Matthews was essentially running a therapy mill, going through the motions with patients without providing any real treatment. He was collecting insurance payments for sessions where he wasn't actually engaged in helping people with their mental health issues. I started researching his background and discovered that several former patients had filed complaints with the state licensing board about similar issues. There were reports of him being distracted during sessions, providing generic advice, and failing to remember important details about patients' lives. The most disturbing thing I learned was that Dr. Matthews had been under investigation for insurance fraud. Apparently, he'd been billing for longer sessions than he actually conducted and claiming to provide specialized treatments that he wasn't qualified to perform. I filed a complaint with the licensing board and provided them with recordings of our sessions as evidence. The investigation revealed that Dr. Matthews had been defrauding both patients and insurance companies for years, providing substandard care while collecting full fees. His license was revoked last month, and he's facing criminal charges for insurance fraud. The investigation found that he'd been doing this with dozens of patients, essentially stealing money, while people believed they were receiving legitimate mental health treatment. The worst part is thinking about all the people who trusted him with their deepest problems and most vulnerable moments, only to discover that he wasn't even paying attention. Some of his patients had been seeing him for years, believing they were making progress in therapy when they were actually just talking to someone who was scrolling through social media. I'm working with a new therapist now, someone who actually listens and provides personalized treatment. But the experience has made me skeptical of mental health professionals in general. I keep wondering how many other therapists are just going through the motions while patients pour their hearts out to someone who doesn't care. The recordings I made probably weren't legal, but they were the only way to prove what was happening in those sessions. Without that evidence, Dr. Matthews would probably still be practicing and taking advantage of vulnerable people who desperately needed real help. That story is over. The violation of trust here is absolutely sickening, because these were people at their most vulnerable seeking help for serious mental health issues. This guy was literally stealing money while people believed they were getting treatment that could save their lives. The fact that he was browsing social media while patients discussed trauma shows a level of callousness that's hard to comprehend. Mental health treatment requires genuine human connection, and he turned it into a fraudulent assembly line operation. Let's move to another story that reveals how people can hide their true nature behind the most ordinary facades. I work as a night janitor at a large office building, and I've discovered that one of the executives has been living there secretly for over a year. I've been cleaning this 30-story office building for about 2 years now. It's mostly filled with accounting firms, law offices, and consulting companies. I work the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., so the building is supposed to be completely empty, except for security guards and maintenance staff. My routine is pretty standard. I clean each floor systematically, emptying trash cans, vacuuming carpets, and sanitizing bathrooms. Most nights, the building is dead quiet except for the hum of ventilation systems and the occasional security guard making rounds. About 6 months ago, I started noticing small things that seemed off on the 23rd floor. There would be coffee cups in trash cans that were still warm, or desk chairs that had been recently adjusted. At first, I thought maybe someone was working extremely late and leaving just before I got to their floor. But then I started finding more personal items. There would be toiletries in the executive bathroom, changes of clothes hanging in supply closets, and food containers that looked like they'd been used for meals rather than just office snacks. The 23rd floor houses Peterson & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm. I'd cleaned their offices hundreds of times and knew the layout well, but lately, one of the corner offices always seemed lived in, even though it was supposed to be empty. I decided to investigate more carefully. I started timing my cleaning of that floor differently, approaching quietly to see if I could catch whoever was staying there. That's when I discovered Richard Peterson. The firm's founder and CEO had essentially moved into his office. The first time I saw him, he was sleeping on an expensive-looking air mattress that he'd set up behind his desk. He had created a makeshift bedroom, complete with pillows, blankets, and a small lamp for reading. When he woke up and saw me, he looked terrified. Richard begged me not to report him to building security or management. He explained that he'd been going through a difficult divorce, and his wife had gotten a restraining order that prevented him from returning to their house. Rather than find an apartment or stay in a hotel, he'd been secretly living in his office. He showed me how he'd been managing this arrangement. He had a mini refrigerator hidden under his desk, a small microwave in his supply closet, and he'd been using the executive bathroom for showering and personal hygiene. He'd even set up a system for doing laundry in the building's utility room. Richard had been incredibly careful about maintaining the illusion that he wasn't living there. He'd arrive at work normally each morning, work his regular schedule, and then simply never leave. After hours, he'd transform his office into a living space, then convert it back to a normal office before other employees arrived. The setup was surprisingly sophisticated. He had blackout curtains that he'd installed to block light from getting out at night, and he'd figured out how to disable the motion sensors in his area so security wouldn't be alerted to movement after hours. Richard explained that his divorce had been financially devastating. His wife had frozen their joint accounts and was demanding half of everything, including his ownership stake in the consulting firm. He couldn't afford both lawyer fees and rent for a new apartment, so living in his office had seemed like a temporary solution. What started as a few nights had turned into over a year of secret residence in the building. Richard had become an expert at avoiding security cameras, timing his movements around guard rotations, and maintaining his professional appearance despite essentially being homeless. The most disturbing part was how this situation had affected his mental health. Richard told me he'd become paranoid and anxious, constantly worried about being discovered. He'd stopped socializing with friends and colleagues because he was afraid someone might figure out his living situation. He'd also been struggling with the practical aspects of living in an office building. He had limited access to fresh food, no proper place to exercise, and was constantly worried about making noise that might alert security or other tenants. Richard offered to pay me to keep his secret, but I told him that wasn't necessary. I felt sorry for him and could see that he was desperate and ashamed of his situation. He seemed like a decent person who'd gotten trapped in circumstances beyond his control. I started helping him in small ways. I'd empty his personal trash separately, so building management wouldn't notice unusual items. I'd let him know if security was doing extra rounds on his floor. Sometimes I'd bring him fresh fruit or other food items that were easier to store in his limited space. But the situation couldn't last forever. Last week, Richard's ex-wife hired a private investigator to track his activities, apparently suspicious about his living arrangements. The investigator discovered evidence of his office residence and reported it to building management. Richard was confronted by building security and management. Yesterday, his lease for office space was terminated immediately, and he was banned from the building. The consulting firm is in chaos because their founder and CEO essentially disappeared overnight. I feel terrible for Richard, but I also understand why the building management had to take action. Having someone living in office space creates liability issues and violates fire codes and zoning regulations. Still, it's heartbreaking to see someone lose everything because of a divorce and end up secretly homeless in their own office. The whole situation makes me wonder how many other people might be secretly living in places where they're not supposed to be, just trying to survive difficult circumstances while maintaining their professional dignity. That story comes to an end. The desperation required to secretly live in your own office for over a year while maintaining a professional facade is genuinely heartbreaking. This guy went from successful business owner to essentially homeless, sleeping on an air mattress behind his desk while pretending everything was normal during work hours. The fact that his divorce drove him to such extreme measures shows how quickly someone's entire life can collapse. Sometimes the executives in corner offices are fighting battles we never see. Our next confession involves someone who uncovered a family secret that had been hidden for decades. I discovered my older brother has been stealing my identity to live a completely different life online, and the extent of his deception is beyond anything I could have imagined. My brother Alex is 32 years old and has always been what you might call a failure to launch. He lives in our parents' basement, works part-time at a pizza place, and has never had a serious relationship or any real ambitions. I'm 26, work as a software engineer, and have generally had my life together since college. About 2 months ago, I started getting friend requests on social media from people I didn't recognize. They were all attractive women who seemed to think they knew me well. Their messages were flirty and familiar, referencing conversations and shared experiences I had no memory of. At first, I thought it might be cases of mistaken identity or spam accounts, but the messages were too specific and personal. These women knew details about my job, my interests, and even my family that wouldn't be available to random strangers online. One woman named Rebecca sent me a particularly confusing message, asking why I'd suddenly stopped responding to her texts and whether I was still planning to visit her in Denver next month. She mentioned specific restaurants we'd supposedly talked about going to and referenced inside jokes that made no sense to me. I decided to investigate further and discovered that someone had been using my photos and personal information to create dating profiles on multiple platforms. The profiles used my real name, my actual photos from social media, and accurate information about my career and hobbies. But the personality described in these profiles was completely different from who I actually am. The fake me was described as spontaneous and adventurous, someone who loved traveling and extreme sports. The real me is pretty introverted and prefers quiet nights at home to skydiving or rock climbing. The fake profiles also claimed I was single and looking for serious relationships, when in reality, I've been with my girlfriend Hannah for 3 years. Whoever created these accounts had been having detailed conversations with dozens of women, some for months at a time. I started piecing together the timeline and realized these profiles had been active for over 2 years. The person behind them had been maintaining relationships with multiple women simultaneously, sharing fake stories about travels and adventures and making promises about meeting in person that never materialized. The breakthrough came when I found a conversation thread where one of the women mentioned details that only someone in my immediate family would know. She referenced a childhood story about our family dog and mentioned my parents' names and occupations. That's when I realized it had to be Alex. He had access to all my photos through family social media accounts, knew intimate details about my life, and had plenty of time to maintain these elaborate online relationships from his basement setup. I confronted him about it last week, and after initially denying everything, he broke down and admitted to creating the fake profiles. He'd been using my identity to live out a fantasy version of himself, one where he was successful, attractive, and interesting to women. Alex explained that he'd started the profiles during a particularly low period in his life, when he was feeling completely worthless. He said pretending to be me gave him confidence and allowed him to experience relationships he could never have as himself. The scope of his deception was staggering. He'd been talking to over 50 women across various platforms, some of whom he'd been stringing along for years. He'd created elaborate backstories about travels to places he'd never been and achievements he'd never accomplished. Some of these women had developed genuine feelings for who they thought was me. They'd shared personal details about their lives, their dreams, and their struggles, all while believing they were building real connections with someone who cared about them. The most disturbing part was discovering that Alex had been collecting personal information about these women. He had detailed notes about their jobs, their families, their insecurities, and their romantic histories. It felt like he'd been treating these relationships as some kind of psychological experiment. Several women had sent intimate photos, believing they were sharing them with someone they trusted and cared about. Alex had saved all of these images, along with screenshots of private conversations that these women never consented to have preserved. When I demanded that he'd delete everything and come clean to all the women he'd been deceiving, Alex became defensive and angry. He said I didn't understand what it was like to be him, to feel invisible and unwanted. He claimed that these relationships were the only thing that made him feel human. He begged me not to expose what he'd done, saying it would destroy the few connections he had left. But I couldn't let him continue manipulating and deceiving these innocent women who thought they were talking to me. I've spent the past week reaching out to as many of the women as I could find, explaining the situation and apologizing for my brother's actions. Most were devastated and angry. Some had already started making plans to visit or meet up with who they thought was me. The hardest conversation was with Rebecca, who had apparently been planning to relocate to my city because she thought we were in love. She'd already given notice at her job and started looking for apartments near where she thought I lived. Alex has since deleted all the profiles, but the damage to these women's lives and trust has already been done. Some of them had turned down real relationship opportunities because they thought they'd found someone special in my fake persona. My parents are horrified and have finally acknowledged that Alex needs serious professional help. He's agreed to see a therapist, but he seems more sorry about getting caught than about the pain he's caused to all these women. The whole experience has made me paranoid about my online presence and worried about what other ways Alex might have been using my identity without my knowledge. I've had to change passwords, update privacy settings, and warn my girlfriend and close friends about what happened. The worst part is knowing that somewhere out there might be women who still don't know they were talking to a fraud, still waiting for messages from someone who never existed in the first place. That story is over. The psychological manipulation here is absolutely chilling because Alex wasn't just catfishing random people. He was systematically destroying lives using his own brother's identity. These women thought they'd found love and were making major life decisions based on a complete fiction. The fact that he kept detailed notes and collected intimate photos shows this went way beyond loneliness into predatory behavior. Some people really will steal anything from family, even your entire identity. Let's move to another story about someone who discovered their seemingly perfect marriage was built on a foundation of lies. My husband of 5 years has been maintaining a secret apartment across town, and what I found there has completely shattered my understanding of who he is as a person. I'm 31, and my husband Michael is 34. We've been together for 7 years total, married for 5, and I thought we had an incredibly strong relationship. He's always been attentive, loving, and completely devoted to our marriage and our 2 young children. Michael works in sales and travels occasionally for work, usually just overnight trips within our state. He's always been very communicative about his schedule and would call me every night when he was away. I never had any reason to suspect he was being unfaithful or dishonest about anything. Last month, I was organising our finances when I noticed some charges on our credit card that didn't make sense. There were monthly payments to a property management company that I didn't recognise, along with utility payments for an address I'd never seen before. When I asked Michael about these charges, he seemed genuinely confused and said he'd look into it. He suggested it might be some kind of billing error or identity theft. A few days later, he told me he'd called the companies, and it was indeed a mistake that had been corrected. But the charges continued appearing on our statements. I decided to investigate on my own and discovered that Michael had been renting a one-bedroom apartment across town for the past 3 years. The lease was in his name only, and he'd been paying rent and utilities with our joint credit card. I drove to the address during my lunch break one day, when I knew Michael was supposedly at work. The apartment complex was nice but unremarkable, the kind of place a single professional might live. I managed to get the apartment number from the leasing office by pretending to be considering moving there. I sat in my car outside the building for 2 hours, not sure what I was hoping to see, or what I would do if I actually encountered Michael there. Finally, I worked up the courage to go to the apartment door and knocked. No one answered, but I could hear music playing inside. I tried calling Michael's cell phone and heard it ringing from within the apartment. When the ringing stopped, the music was turned down, but no one came to the door. That evening, I confronted Michael directly about the apartment. I told him I knew about the lease, the utility payments, and that I'd been to the building. His face went completely white, and for several minutes, he just stared at me without speaking. Finally, he admitted that he'd been renting the apartment, but insisted it wasn't what I thought. He said he'd gotten it as a place to decompress and have some alone time away from the stress of work and family responsibilities. He claimed he'd never brought another woman there, and that he just used it to think and recharge. I demanded to see the apartment immediately. Michael reluctantly agreed and drove me there that night. When he opened the door, I was shocked by what I found inside. The apartment was fully furnished and decorated, but not like any space Michael had ever created before. The walls were covered with artwork and posters that reflected interests I'd never known he had. There were books about philosophy and spirituality that he'd never mentioned reading. The kitchen was stocked with gourmet cooking ingredients, when Michael barely knew how to make toast at home. But the most disturbing discovery was a walk-in closet filled with clothes that weren't his usual style. There were expensive suits, casual wear, and accessories that looked like they belonged to a completely different person. Everything was organised meticulously, like a curated wardrobe for someone with sophisticated tastes. On the bathroom counter, I found cologne, skincare products, and grooming supplies that were nothing like what Michael used at home. There were also prescription bottles with his name on them for medications I'd never seen him take. The apartment had clearly been lived in regularly. There were personal touches everywhere, photos of places Michael claimed he'd never visited, and a journal filled with his handwriting describing experiences and thoughts that seemed to come from a stranger. As I read through the journal, I realised that Michael had been using this apartment to live as a completely different version of himself. The entries described a sophisticated, cultured man who attended art galleries, read literature, and had deep philosophical thoughts about life. The journal also contained detailed plans for this alternate life. Michael had been researching graduate programs, career changes, and even considering relocating to other cities. He'd been exploring possibilities for a future that didn't seem to include me or our children. Most shocking were entries about feeling trapped in his current life and wondering what would happen if he just disappeared one day. He wrote about envying people who could reinvent themselves and start over somewhere new with a clean slate. When I confronted him with the journal, Michael broke down completely. He admitted that he'd been struggling with his identity for years and feeling like he was living someone else's life. He said the apartment was his way of exploring who he might have been if he'd made different choices. He explained that the clothes, the books, and the lifestyle represented the person he wished he could be, someone more interesting and accomplished than the suburban father and husband he'd become. He'd been spending several hours there each week, sometimes after work and sometimes on weekends when he claimed to be running errands. The most devastating revelation was that Michael had been actively researching how to disappear and start a new life somewhere else. He'd looked into changing his name, getting new identification, and covering his tracks. The journal contained detailed plans for abandoning his current life and becoming this alternate version of himself permanently. Michael insisted that he'd never acted on these plans and that he loved me and our children. He said the apartment was just a fantasy space where he could imagine different possibilities, not something he ever intended to make real, but I found evidence that suggested otherwise. There were job applications for positions in other states, correspondence with apartment rental agencies in different cities, and research about schools and neighborhoods far from where we currently live. The betrayal I felt wasn't just about the secret apartment or the money he'd spent without telling me. It was about discovering that the man I'd married and built a life with had been secretly planning to abandon that life and become someone completely different. We're in marriage counseling now, trying to work through this revelation and its implications for our relationship. Michael has agreed to give up the apartment and be completely transparent about his whereabouts and activities going forward. But I don't know if I can ever trust him again or feel secure in our marriage, knowing that he's capable of maintaining such an elaborate double life. The fact that he'd been planning potential escape routes while I thought we were building a future together has fundamentally changed how I see our relationship. The hardest part is explaining to our children why Daddy has been so sad lately and why Mommy and Daddy have been having so many serious conversations. They're too young to understand the complexity of what's happened, but they can sense that something has changed in our family dynamic. That story comes to an end. The idea of someone maintaining an entire alternate identity, complete with different clothes, interests, and life plans, is genuinely terrifying. This wasn't just having a secret space. This was actively researching how to disappear and abandon his family to become someone else entirely. The fact that he was using their joint credit card to fund his escape planning makes it even more calculating and cruel. Sometimes the person sleeping next to you is dreaming of a life where you don't exist. Our next confession comes from someone who made a discovery about their workplace that changed everything they thought they knew about their job. I work at what I thought was a legitimate research facility, but I recently discovered we've been unknowingly participating in unethical human experimentation for the past 2 years. I'm a research assistant at Meridian Labs, a private facility that conducts studies on human behavior and psychology. I was hired straight out of college and was excited to work in what seemed like a cutting-edge research environment. The pay was excellent, and my colleagues were all highly educated professionals who seemed passionate about advancing scientific knowledge. Our primary project involved studying stress responses and decision-making patterns in controlled environments. Participants were recruited through online advertisements and were paid well for their time. They'd come to our facility for sessions that lasted anywhere from 2 to 8 hours, during which we'd monitor their physiological responses to various stimuli. The studies seemed legitimate and followed what appeared to be proper ethical protocols. Participants signed detailed consent forms, were debriefed after sessions, and seemed comfortable with the procedures. Everything appeared to be standard psychological research, the kind conducted at universities and research institutions worldwide. My role involved monitoring participants during sessions, collecting data, and helping to analyze results. I worked primarily with Dr. Richardson, the lead researcher who had impressive credentials and seemed genuinely committed to producing valuable scientific knowledge. About 6 months ago, I started noticing some irregularities in our protocols that made me uncomfortable. Participants were sometimes given substances they were told were vitamins or supplements, but the effects seemed stronger than what you'd expect from standard nutritional products. Some participants would become unusually drowsy or experience mood changes that seemed disproportionate to the mild stressors we were supposedly exposing them to. When I asked Dr. Richardson about this, he explained that some people are more sensitive to environmental factors than others. I also noticed that our consent forms were extremely vague about the specific procedures participants would undergo. While they covered general risks and benefits, they didn't provide detailed information about the substances they might be given or the full range of stimuli they'd be exposed to. The breakthrough came when I accidentally accessed the wrong file directory on our shared server. Instead of finding the data files I needed, I discovered a folder containing what appeared to be the real documentation for our studies. These documents revealed that our research was being funded by a pharmaceutical company that was using our facility to conduct unauthorized drug trials. The supplements we'd been giving participants were actually experimental medications that hadn't been approved for human testing. The studies weren't about stress responses or decision-making at all. We were testing the effects of various compounds on cognitive function, emotional regulation, and physical coordination. Some of the substances we'd been administering were potentially dangerous and had known side effects that weren't disclosed to participants. The most disturbing discovery was that several participants had experienced adverse reactions that were documented in files I'd never seen before. Some had developed persistent headaches, memory problems, and mood disorders after their sessions. These reactions were being tracked and analysed, but the participants themselves were never informed about the connection to their exposure at our facility. I found correspondence between Dr. Richardson and executives at the pharmaceutical company discussing how to minimize legal liability while maximizing data collection. They were deliberately recruiting participants from vulnerable populations who were less likely to report problems or pursue legal action if they experienced negative effects. The consent forms had been carefully crafted to provide legal protection while revealing as little as possible about the true nature of the experiments. Participants thought they were helping with academic research when they were actually serving as unpaid test subjects for potentially dangerous drug trials. When I confronted Dr. Richardson with this information, he initially tried to deny everything and claimed I'd misunderstood what I'd found. When I pressed him with specific details from the files, he eventually admitted the truth, but tried to justify the deception. He argued that the research we were conducting was potentially valuable and that traditional clinical trial processes were too slow and expensive. He said participants were being compensated fairly and that the risks were minimal compared to the potential benefits of the medications we were testing. Dr. Richardson also threatened my job and my future career prospects if I disclosed what I'd learned. He said the pharmaceutical industry was small and that whistleblowers rarely found employment in research positions afterward. He suggested I should be grateful for the experience and the generous salary rather than creating problems. I struggled with this information for weeks, knowing that reporting it would likely end my career, but feeling obligated to protect future participants from potentially harmful experimentation. I documented everything I could access and made copies of the most incriminating files. I finally reported the situation to the FDA and the Institutional Review Board that supposedly oversees research ethics in our area. The investigation that followed revealed that Meridian Labs had been operating without proper oversight for over 3 years. The facility was shut down immediately, and several staff members, including Dr. Richardson, were arrested on charges related to conducting unauthorized human experimentation. The pharmaceutical company that funded the research is now facing multiple lawsuits from participants who experienced adverse effects. I've been cooperating with federal investigators and providing testimony about what I witnessed during my time at the facility. The legal process is complex and ongoing, but it's clear that dozens of people were exposed to experimental drugs without their informed consent. The hardest part has been reaching out to former participants to inform them about what they were actually exposed to during their sessions. Many are angry and frightened, especially those who've experienced unexplained health problems since participating in our studies. Some participants have developed chronic conditions that may be related to the experimental medications they unknowingly received. They're now facing medical bills and ongoing health issues, all because they thought they were helping with legitimate research. I've lost my job and my career in research, just as Dr. Richardson predicted. But I couldn't live with the knowledge that people were being harmed by experiments they never consented to participate in. The guilt of being unknowingly complicit in this deception for 2 years is something I'll have to carry forever. The investigation has revealed that this type of unethical experimentation is more common than most people realize. There are research facilities operating under the guise of legitimate science while actually conducting unauthorized trials for pharmaceutical companies looking to bypass expensive and time-consuming regulatory processes. That story is over. The systematic exploitation of people who thought they were participating in legitimate research is absolutely horrifying. These participants trusted the system and ended up as unwitting test subjects for potentially dangerous drugs, some developing chronic health problems as a result. The fact that this was happening at multiple facilities suggests a much larger problem with oversight in private research. Sometimes the people in lab coats aren't the good guys, after all. Let me transition to another story that reveals how technology can be weaponized in the most unexpected ways. I've been receiving anonymous packages at my house for the past 6 months, and I finally discovered who's been sending them and why. It started in March when I found a small box on my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a brand new phone charger, the exact model I needed for my old phone. I thought maybe a family member had sent it, but when I asked around, no one claimed responsibility. The packages kept coming every few weeks, always useful items I actually needed, like a replacement water filter for my refrigerator, new batteries for my smoke detector, or a specific type of pen I use for work. It was like someone was monitoring my daily life and sending me things before I even realized I needed them. The items were never expensive or flashy, just practical things that improved my daily routine. A better coffee mug when mine broke, reading glasses when I started squinting at small print, a phone stand when I kept dropping my device while watching videos. At first, I was grateful for these mysterious gifts. The timing was always perfect, and the items were exactly what I would have bought for myself. But as months passed, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the surveillance implications. Someone was clearly watching me closely enough to know when my household items needed replacing. They knew what brand of coffee I drank, what size clothes I wore, even which specific replacement parts my appliances required. I started documenting each package, photographing the items, and noting when they arrived. The pattern became clear. The sender had intimate knowledge of my daily habits and routines. They knew when I ran out of things before I did. The packages escalated in March when I received a first aid kit the day before I cut my hand cooking dinner. Then came a bottle of specific allergy medication, 2 days before pollen season started affecting me. The timing was becoming eerily predictive. I set up a security camera to catch whoever was delivering these packages. The footage showed a woman in her 50s wearing a postal service uniform, but she wasn't driving an official mail truck. She'd arrive in a personal vehicle and place packages on my doorstep during times when I was typically at work. I managed to get her license plate number and did some investigation. The car was registered to Linda Morrison, a name I didn't recognize. I looked her up online and found her social media profiles, but nothing explained why she'd been sending me packages. Last week, I decided to confront her directly. I waited by my front window until she arrived with another package, then went outside to talk to her. When she saw me approaching, she looked terrified and started apologizing profusely. Linda explained that she was my biological mother who had given me up for adoption 32 years ago. She'd been tracking my life through social media and public records, trying to find ways to help me without revealing her identity. She said she'd been watching my posts and photos, looking for clues about what I might need in my daily life. When I mentioned broken items or complained about household problems online, She'd research solutions and send them anonymously. Linda had been working part-time for a package delivery service, which gave her access to postal uniforms and knowledge about delivery schedules. She'd been using this job as cover to deliver gifts to me personally without arousing suspicion. The most heartbreaking part was learning that she'd been doing this for other adopted children she'd placed over the years. She had 3 other biological children she'd given up in her 20s, and she'd been secretly helping all of us through anonymous gifts and support. Linda showed me a notebook where she'd been tracking all 4 of her children's lives, noting our achievements, struggles, and needs. She'd been sending care packages to my siblings too, always anonymously, always perfectly timed to help with whatever challenges we were facing. She explained that she'd gotten pregnant as a teenager and couldn't provide proper care for her children. She'd spent decades feeling guilty about the decisions she'd made and had been trying to help us from a distance as a way to cope with her regret. Linda had never tried to contact any of us directly because she didn't want to disrupt the lives we'd built with our adoptive families. She said the anonymous gifts were her way of being a mother to us without overstepping boundaries or creating complications. When I asked why she'd finally revealed herself, Linda said she'd been diagnosed with cancer and wanted at least one of her children to know the truth before she died. She said she couldn't bear the thought of passing away without any of us knowing that someone had been watching over us all these years. We've been meeting for coffee regularly since then, and I've learned so much about my biological family history. Linda is starting chemotherapy next month, and I've offered to help her through the treatment process. The strangest part is realizing that all those perfectly timed gifts weren't coincidences or luck. They were acts of love from someone who'd been caring about me from a distance for my entire adult life. Every useful item, every thoughtful package was her way of trying to be the mother she couldn't be openly. I've connected with 2 of my biological siblings who are also receiving mysterious packages from Linda. We're all processing this revelation differently, but we're grateful to finally understand where these gifts were coming from and why they always seemed to arrive exactly when we needed them most. That story ends there. The dedication required to secretly monitor and care for 4 different children from a distance for decades is absolutely staggering. She turned guilt and regret into this elaborate system of anonymous love and support. It's both beautiful and heartbreaking that she felt she couldn't reach out directly, but found this incredible way to still be present in their lives. Sometimes, the most profound acts of parenting happen completely in the shadows. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their neighbour was running a much more sinister operation than anyone realised. I've been living next to what I thought was a quiet elderly man for 3 years, but I recently discovered he's been running an elaborate identity theft operation targeting people in our neighbourhood. My neighbour Gerald is in his 70s and lives alone in a modest house next to mine. He's always been friendly but reserved, the kind of person who waves from his garden but doesn't engage in long conversations. He seemed like the perfect neighbour, quiet and unobtrusive. About 4 months ago, I started getting calls from debt collectors looking for people I'd never heard of. They were asking for individuals with names I didn't recognise, but they had my phone number and sometimes even my address. I assumed it was just a case of wrong numbers or outdated information. The calls became more frequent and more aggressive. Collectors were demanding payment for credit cards, loans and medical bills that belonged to people I'd never met. Some of the debts were substantial, in the tens of thousands of dollars. I started keeping track of the names the collectors were asking for. Over 2 months, I counted at least 15 different people who supposedly owed money and were somehow connected to my contact information. The pattern was too consistent to be random mistakes. One morning, I was taking out my trash when I noticed Gerald collecting mail from several houses on our street. He had keys to multiple mailboxes and was systematically gathering envelopes from homes where I knew the residents were either elderly or frequently travelled. I watched him more carefully over the next few days and realised he had an established routine. He'd collect mail from specific houses early in the morning, usually on days when he knew the residents would be at work or away from home. Gerald had somehow obtained keys to mailboxes belonging to at least 6 different neighbours. He'd wait for opportune moments when people were gone, then quickly gather their mail before returning to his house with armfuls of envelopes. I decided to investigate what he was doing with all this mail. One evening, I positioned myself where I could see into his living room window. Gerald had set up what looked like a small office with filing cabinets, a computer, and stacks of opened mail organised into neat piles. He was systematically going through people's personal correspondence, pulling out anything that contained financial information or personal details. I watched him photograph documents with his phone and enter information into spreadsheets on his computer. The scope of his operation became clear when I saw him on the phone using different names and voices. He'd call credit card companies, banks and medical offices, pretending to be various neighbours and requesting information about their accounts. Gerald had mastered the art of social engineering, using personal details gleaned from stolen mail to convince customer service representatives that he was the legitimate account holder. He'd request password resets, address changes, and account information. I realised he'd been using this stolen information to open new credit accounts in other people's names. He'd apply for credit cards and loans using neighbours' identities, then have the cards sent to addresses he controlled or picked up from mail facilities. The most disturbing part was discovering that Gerald had been targeting specific types of people. He focused on elderly neighbours who might not notice unusual activity quickly, and people who travelled frequently for work and wouldn't immediately miss mail deliveries. He'd been building detailed profiles of everyone on our street, tracking their schedules, their financial habits, and their personal information. Gerald knew when people went on vacation, when they worked late, and when they'd be most vulnerable to having their mail stolen. I found evidence that he'd been selling some of the stolen identities to other criminals. There were records of transactions where he'd provide complete identity packages, including social security numbers, birth dates, and financial account information, to buyers who would use them for larger fraud schemes. The debt collectors who'd been calling me weren't looking for the actual people who owed money. They were trying to collect on fraudulent debts that Gerald had created using stolen identities, and somehow my contact information had gotten mixed into his system. When I reported Gerald to the police, they initially seemed skeptical that such an elderly, mild-mannered man could be running a sophisticated fraud operation. But when they searched his house, they found evidence of identity theft affecting over 40 people in our neighbourhood and surrounding areas. Gerald had filing cabinets full of stolen personal documents, computers containing thousands of pieces of personal information, and detailed records of fraudulent accounts he'd opened. He'd stolen over $200,000 using other people's identities over the past 3 years. The investigation revealed that Gerald had been doing this in other neighbourhoods before moving to ours. He'd relocate every few years, establish himself as a trustworthy neighbour, then spend months or years systematically stealing from the people around him. Many of my neighbours had no idea their identities had been compromised until police contacted them during the investigation. Some discovered they had credit accounts they'd never opened, loans they'd never applied for, and damaged credit scores they couldn't explain. Gerald pleaded guilty to multiple counts of identity theft and fraud. He's now serving a 10-year prison sentence, but the damage he caused to dozens of families will take years to repair. Some neighbours are still dealing with fraudulent accounts and trying to restore their credit. The scariest part is realising how easily he manipulated everyone's trust. Gerald seemed like the ideal neighbour, someone you'd feel comfortable asking to watch your house while you're away, or collect your mail during vacations. He used our community's sense of trust and security against us. That story comes to an end. The calculated nature of this operation is absolutely chilling because Gerald weaponized the basic trust that makes neighborhoods function. He spent years building relationships just to systematically destroy people's financial lives while maintaining this perfect neighbour facade. The fact that he'd done this in multiple communities suggests there might be other Geralds out there, patiently building trust before striking. Sometimes the person offering to help with your mail is the last person who should have access to it. Let's move to another story that reveals how far some people will go to maintain their secrets. I discovered my teenage daughter has been running a successful online business for 2 years, and the products she's selling have completely shocked me. My daughter Riley is 16 years old and has always been creative and entrepreneurial. She's constantly working on art projects, making things with her hands, and talking about different business ideas she wants to try someday. I've always encouraged her creativity and independence. Over the past 2 years, Riley has seemed more confident and financially independent than most teenagers. She's been buying her own clothes, paying for activities with friends, and even offered to contribute to household expenses when money was tight. When I asked where her income came from, she said she'd been doing odd jobs and selling crafts online. I was proud of her initiative and didn't pry too deeply into the details. She showed me some jewellery and artwork she'd made, and I assumed that was the extent of her business activities. The items looked professionally made, and I figured she had a natural talent for crafts. Riley had been spending a lot of time in her room working on projects, often staying up late and waking up early to check her computer. She said she was building her online presence and learning about digital marketing, which seemed like valuable skills for a teenager to develop. Last month, I needed to borrow Riley's laptop, while mine was being repaired. She seemed hesitant to let me use it, but eventually agreed, saying she just needed to close some personal files first. I didn't think much of her reluctance at the time. While working on my project, I accidentally clicked on the wrong bookmark and found myself on a website I didn't recognize. It took me a moment to realize I was looking at an online store that featured Riley's name and photo prominently on the homepage. The website was professionally designed and appeared to be selling what looked like custom artwork and handmade items. But as I browsed through the product listings, I realized the items were much more sophisticated and expensive than the simple crafts I'd seen Riley making. The store was selling detailed custom portraits, complex digital art pieces, and personalized items that would require advanced skills and professional equipment. The prices ranged from $50 for simple items to several $100s for elaborate custom work. I looked at the customer reviews and realized Riley had hundreds of satisfied buyers who praised her work quality and professionalism. Some reviews mentioned quick turnaround times and excellent customer service, suggesting this was a well-established business operation. The most shocking discovery was finding a separate section of the website that sold what appeared to be custom digital content for adult clients. The listings were carefully worded, but clearly advertised personalized digital artwork featuring mature themes and adult-oriented customization. Riley had been creating custom digital art for adult clients who wanted personalized content featuring specific themes, characters, or scenarios. The work was artistic and skillfully done, but it was definitely intended for mature audiences and commanded premium prices. I realized my 16-year-old daughter had been running a sophisticated online business that catered to adult clients seeking custom digital artwork. She'd built a professional website, managed customer relationships, and developed a reputation for quality work in a very specialized market. The financial records I found showed that Riley had been earning between $2,000 and $4,000 per month from her business. She'd been handling complex custom orders, managing deadlines, and maintaining professional relationships with clients who had no idea she was a teenager. When I confronted Riley about what I'd discovered, she was initially defensive, but eventually explained how her business had evolved. She said it started with simple art commissions, but she'd gradually moved into more specialized and lucrative markets as her skills improved. Riley explained that she'd been careful to maintain professional boundaries with clients and never revealed personal information about herself. She used a business name and professional email address, and most clients assumed she was an adult freelance artist. She insisted that her work was purely artistic and that she'd never engaged in anything inappropriate or dangerous. Riley said she researched legal requirements and made sure her business activities were legitimate, even if she hadn't been completely transparent about her age. The most concerning aspect was learning that Riley had been managing complex financial transactions, including international payments and tax obligations, without any adult supervision. She'd set up business accounts, tracked income and expenses, and was handling responsibilities that most adults would find challenging. Riley showed me examples of her work, and I had to admit it was incredibly sophisticated and professional. She'd developed skills in digital art, customer service, and business management that were far beyond what I'd expected from a teenager, but I was also concerned about the potential risks of her operating in adult-oriented markets without proper oversight. Even though her work was artistic, she was interacting with adult clients who might not have appropriate boundaries if they discovered her real age. We've been working together to restructure her business in ways that are more appropriate for her age, while still allowing her to develop her entrepreneurial skills. Riley has agreed to focus on markets that are more suitable for teenage business owners and to be more transparent about her activities. The hardest part has been processing the fact that my daughter had been successfully running a complex business operation while I thought she was just making crafts in her bedroom. Her maturity and business acumen are impressive, but I wish she'd felt comfortable being more open about what she was doing. Riley's success has shown me that teenagers are capable of much more than we often give them credit for. But it also highlighted the importance of maintaining open communication about online activities and business ventures, even when our children seem to be managing things independently. That story is finished. The complexity and success of this operation is genuinely impressive, but also terrifying from a parenting perspective. A 16-year-old running a multi-thousand-dollar business while creating content for adult clients raises so many safety and legal concerns. The fact that she managed professional relationships, international payments, and tax obligations shows incredible maturity, but also highlights how easy it is for minors to operate in adult spaces online without proper oversight. Sometimes, our children's talents take them into territories we never imagined possible. Here's another confession that shows how quickly someone's entire world can be turned upside down by a single discovery. I found out my best friend of 15 years has been systematically poisoning me with small doses of medication, and her reason for doing it is more disturbing than I could have imagined. My best friend Carmen and I have been inseparable since college. We live in the same city, work in related fields, and spend several evenings a week together. She's been like a sister to me, someone I trusted completely with my deepest secrets and biggest concerns. Over the past year, I've been experiencing strange health issues that my doctors couldn't explain. I'd have episodes of dizziness, nausea, and confusion that would come and go without any apparent cause. Sometimes I'd feel completely fine. Other times I'd be so disoriented I couldn't drive or work effectively. The symptoms were inconsistent and seemed unrelated to anything in my diet, exercise routine, or stress levels. I saw multiple specialists, had countless blood tests, and even underwent expensive scans and procedures, trying to identify what was causing these problems. Carmen was incredibly supportive during this health crisis. She'd drive me to doctor appointments, bring me soup when I was feeling sick, and spend hours researching possible causes of my symptoms online. She seemed genuinely concerned and invested in helping me figure out what was wrong. The breakthrough came when I noticed that my symptoms were always worse after spending time with Carmen. At first, I thought it might be coincidence or that I was more likely to notice problems when I was with someone who cared about my health. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. I'd feel fine in the morning, spend the afternoon with Carmen, and then experience severe symptoms that evening or the next day. The correlation was too consistent to be random. I started documenting when my symptoms occurred and what I'd eaten or drunk when I was with Carmen. The pattern showed that I was most likely to get sick after drinking coffee, tea, or other beverages that Carmen had prepared or brought to me. Last month, I decided to test my suspicions by secretly recording one of our coffee dates. I set up my phone to record while we were sitting in my kitchen, pretending to check messages while Carmen prepared drinks for both of us. The footage showed Carmen adding something to my coffee while I was distracted. She pulled a small container from her purse and added what looked like powder or crushed pills to my drink, stirring carefully to make sure it dissolved completely. I was horrified but needed more evidence before confronting her. I started paying closer attention to Carmen's behaviour and noticed she always insisted on preparing beverages or bringing food when we spent time together. She'd get agitated if I wanted to make my own drinks or if we went places where she couldn't control what I consumed. I collected samples of drinks Carmen had prepared and had them tested at a private laboratory. The results showed traces of prescription medications that I'd never been prescribed, including sedatives and drugs used to treat psychiatric conditions. Carmen had been systematically drugging me with medications that would cause exactly the symptoms I'd been experiencing. The doses were small enough to avoid causing serious harm, but consistent enough to make me feel chronically unwell and confused. When I confronted Carmen with the evidence, she initially denied everything and claimed the test results must be wrong. But when I showed her the video footage of her adding substances to my drink, she broke down and admitted what she'd been doing. Her explanation was more disturbing than I'd anticipated. Carmen said she'd been jealous of my success and happiness and wanted to make me dependent on her for support. She thought if I was always sick and struggling, I'd rely on her more, and she'd become more important in my life. She'd been stealing medications from her job at a medical office and researching which drugs would cause the symptoms she wanted me to experience. Carmen had been conducting a deliberate campaign to undermine my health and independence while positioning herself as my primary source of support and care. The most chilling part was learning that she'd been documenting my reactions to different medications and adjusting the doses based on how I responded. She kept detailed notes about which drugs worked best and how to administer them without detection. Carmen also admitted that she'd been hoping my health problems would eventually cost me my job or force me to move back in with family, situations where she could insert herself as my primary caregiver and support system. She wanted to create a scenario where I'd be completely dependent on her. The psychological manipulation was as disturbing as the physical poisoning. Carmen had been offering comfort and support for problems she was secretly creating, making herself seem indispensable while actively harming my health and well-being. I reported Carmen to the police immediately, and she was arrested on charges of assault and drugging someone without consent. The investigation revealed that she'd been stealing controlled substances from her workplace for over a year. The medical consequences of her actions are still being evaluated. I've had to undergo extensive testing to determine if there are any long-term effects from the medications she'd been giving me, and I'm working with specialists to address any ongoing health issues. The betrayal has been devastating in ways that go beyond the physical harm. Carmen was the person I turned to for support during the health crisis she was secretly causing. She sat with me in doctors' offices, held my hand during procedures, and comforted me about symptoms she was deliberately creating. Rebuilding trust with people has been incredibly difficult since learning that someone I considered family was capable of such calculated cruelty. I find myself questioning every relationship and wondering what other people in my life might be hiding behind facades of care and concern. That story reaches its conclusion. The systematic nature of this poisoning campaign is absolutely terrifying because Carmen turned friendship itself into a weapon. She weaponized care and concern, while literally conducting medical experiments on someone who trusted her completely. The fact that she kept detailed notes and adjusted dosages shows this wasn't impulsive behavior, but a calculated, long-term plan to destroy someone's independence. Sometimes the person offering to take care of you is the reason you need taking care of in the first place. This next story is eerily similar to one we've seen before, but with a major twist. I've been living with my roommate Ashley for a bit now, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about her daily routine. But recently, I discovered something that has me questioning whether I should move out or call someone for help. It started when I noticed my food going missing. Not entire meals, but small portions. A few spoonfuls of yogurt here, half a banana there, a couple crackers missing from the sleeve. I initially thought maybe I was just forgetting what I'd eaten, but then I started paying closer attention. Ashley works from our apartment during the day, while I work at an office. I started setting up my phone to record the kitchen area before leaving for work, telling myself I was just trying to catch a potential break-in or figure out if we had mice. What I captured on video was so much worse than mice. Every day, around noon, Ashley would come into the kitchen and methodically go through all of my food. She'd open containers, smell everything, and then take tiny portions of whatever appealed to her. But here's the disturbing part. She would chew each bite exactly 37 times before swallowing. I know because I counted while watching the footage. After chewing, she would write detailed notes in a small notebook about the taste, texture, and what she imagined my emotional state was when I purchased or prepared each item. She had entire paragraphs dedicated to analysing my mental health based on whether I bought name brand versus generic cereal. The notebook entries were incredibly detailed. Things like Tuesday yogurt suggests depression, choosing strawberry over vanilla indicates desire for sweetness missing from life, and leftover pasta eaten cold shows time management issues and possible anxiety about meal planning. But it gets weirder. After analysing and consuming small portions of my food, Ashley would recreate exact miniature versions of what she'd eaten using clay. She had an entire shelf in her room dedicated to tiny clay sculptures of every single thing she'd stolen from me over the past 8 months. I found this shelf when she asked me to grab her laptop charger from her room while she was in the shower. Hundreds of tiny clay food items, each labelled with dates and my supposed emotional state when I'd purchased them. There was a clay representation of every meal I'd eaten, every snack I'd bought, every leftover I'd saved. The most unsettling part was a section she'd labelled future foods, clay sculptures of meals she thought I should eat based on her analysis of my psychological needs. She'd created an entire meal plan for me using clay, complete with portion sizes and timing recommendations. When I confronted Ashley about the food theft, she broke down completely. She admitted that she'd been doing this to all of her previous roommates for years. She said she was studying to become a nutritionist and was conducting observational research on how people's food choices reflected their inner lives. She claimed she'd learned more about human psychology from stealing and analysing people's food than she ever did in school. She said the clay sculptures helped her remember the data she'd collected and that she planned to write her thesis based on these observations. Ashley begged me not to move out, promising she'd stop taking my food, but she asked if she could continue making the clay sculptures based on what she observed me eating, saying it was crucial for her academic work. I honestly don't know what to do. The whole thing is so bizarre and invasive, but she seems genuinely convinced that she's conducting important research. She's not violent or threatening, just incredibly strange and boundary crossing. That story is over. The level of psychological analysis this woman was doing based on stolen yogurt bites is genuinely unhinged. Creating an entire thesis project around secretly studying your roommate's emotional state through food theft crosses every possible boundary. The clay sculptures make it even more disturbing because she's creating permanent monuments to her invasive behaviour. I'd be running for the hills after discovering that creepy little food shrine in her bedroom. Let's move on to something that shows how one person's good intentions can spiral into absolute chaos. I work as a night security guard at a small office building downtown. It's usually quiet work, just walking around, checking doors and making sure nobody breaks in. But about 3 months ago, I started noticing that someone was leaving care packages for the homeless people who sleep in the alley behind our building. At first, I thought it was really sweet. Someone was quietly leaving sandwiches, bottled water, and warm blankets without making a big show of it. The homeless folk seemed grateful, and it wasn't causing any problems for the building. But then the care packages started getting more elaborate. Whoever was leaving them began including handwritten notes with detailed life advice, job listings, and sometimes even small amounts of cash. The notes were incredibly personal. Like this person knew intimate details about each homeless person's background and situation, I started staying up later during my rounds to try to catch the Good Samaritan in action. After a few weeks of late-night stakeouts, I finally saw who was behind the care packages. It was Mrs. Patterson, a 70-year-old woman who lives in the apartment building across the street. She was methodically setting up what looked like an outdoor dining area, complete with folding chairs and a small camping table. She'd prepared individual meals for each person, complete with handwritten place cards with their names. But here's where it gets weird. Mrs. Patterson wasn't just leaving the food and going home. She was hiding behind a dumpster with binoculars, watching and taking detailed notes about how each person reacted to their meal and whether they read her advice letters. Over the next few weeks, her surveillance operation became more sophisticated. She started using a telephoto camera to photograph the homeless individuals throughout the day, documenting their routines, interactions, and behavioural patterns. She created detailed profiles of each person, tracking everything from their sleep schedules to their social dynamics. Mrs. Patterson began tailoring her care packages based on this surveillance data. If she observed someone looking sad, she'd include motivational quotes. If someone seemed to have a conflict with another person, she'd include conflict resolution literature. If someone appeared to be struggling with substance abuse, she'd include pamphlets about treatment programs. The homeless community started noticing that the care packages contained eerily specific advice that seemed to address their exact situations. Some people were grateful, but others became paranoid about being watched so closely. Things escalated when Mrs. Patterson started following individual homeless people during the day to gather more data for her care packages. She'd trail them to social services appointments, medical visits, and job interviews, always maintaining what she thought was a discreet distance. One day, I witnessed her approaching a homeless veteran named Tony with a care package that included his military service records, medical information, and copies of paperwork from his recent VA appointment. She'd somehow obtained confidential documents about his benefits claim and mental health treatment. Tony was understandably freaked out and called the police. When officers questioned Mrs. Patterson, she explained that she was conducting comprehensive case management for her clients and that her surveillance was necessary to provide appropriate support services. She had converted her entire apartment into what looked like a social services command centre. She had bulletin boards covered with photos, timelines, and detailed case files for over 20 different homeless individuals. She'd created organisational charts showing relationships between different people, tracked their daily routines on spreadsheets, and even developed treatment plans that she was implementing through her care packages. Mrs. Patterson genuinely believed she was providing better social services than any official agency. She'd spent her entire retirement savings on this operation and had been working 16-hour days conducting surveillance and preparing individualised care packages. The police had to explain to her that following people, photographing them without consent, and obtaining their private medical information was illegal stalking, regardless of her good intentions. She was devastated when they told her to stop, crying that she was the only person who really cared about these individuals, and that without her intervention, they'd never get the help they needed. The whole situation has left everyone involved feeling conflicted. Mrs. Patterson's heart was in the right place, but her methods were completely inappropriate and invasive. That story is over. This is what happens when good intentions collide with zero understanding of boundaries or privacy laws. Mrs. Patterson essentially created a one-woman surveillance state in the name of helping people. The fact that she obtained confidential medical records shows how far she was willing to go in her misguided mission. It's both heartbreaking and terrifying that someone could convince themselves that stalking vulnerable people was actually a form of charity work. Our next confession comes from someone who made a discovery about their family that changes everything they thought they knew about their childhood. I'm 28 years old, and I just found out that my entire childhood was essentially a lie. Last month, while helping my parents clean out their attic, I discovered a box of documents that revealed something so shocking that I'm still processing it weeks later. Growing up, my parents always told me I was an only child and that they'd tried for years to have another baby, but couldn't. They seemed sad about it, and I always felt a little guilty for not being enough to complete their family. But in that attic box, I found birth certificates, medical records, and legal documents proving that I have a twin brother who was given up for adoption when we were 3 days old. The paperwork showed that my brother was born with a cleft palate and some other minor medical issues that would require surgery and ongoing treatment. According to the documents, my parents decided they couldn't handle the medical expenses and emotional stress of caring for a child with special needs. What made it worse was finding their handwritten notes discussing the decision. They'd literally made a pros and cons list about keeping both babies versus giving up the one who would be more work. They calculated the projected medical costs, discussed the impact on their lifestyle, and ultimately decided that one healthy child was preferable to one healthy child and one who would need extra care. The adoption agency paperwork showed that they'd specifically requested a closed adoption with no future contact, and they'd instructed the agency to tell the adoptive family that the birth parents wanted no relationship with the child. But here's the part that really destroyed me. I found evidence that they'd been getting annual updates about my brother for 25 years. The adoption agency had been sending photos, report cards, and letters from his adoptive family, and my parents had been keeping them in this secret box. I spent hours going through these updates, watching my twin brother grow up in photos while I had no idea he existed. His adoptive family seemed wonderful. They got him the medical care he needed, supported him through multiple surgeries, and he grew up to become an engineer. The cleft palate was completely corrected, and you can barely tell he ever had any medical issues. The letters from his adoptive parents were heartbreaking to read. For years they'd been hoping that someday we might be able to meet or have some kind of relationship. They'd sent photos of him at birthdays, graduations, and other milestones, always including notes about how he wondered about his biological family. My brother had apparently asked about his birth parents throughout his childhood, and his adoptive parents had been honest with him about being placed for adoption. They'd told him that if he ever wanted to search for his biological family, when he turned 18, they would support him. But my parents had made sure that could never happen by requesting complete confidentiality and refusing any contact. When I confronted my parents about this discovery, they were defensive and claimed they'd made the best decision they could under difficult circumstances. They said they were young, financially stressed, and didn't think they could properly care for a child with medical needs. My mother actually said that they'd given my brother a better life by placing him with a family who could afford his medical care. She seemed to genuinely believe they'd done him a favour. But then I found the parts that really shattered my worldview. In their handwritten notes, they'd discussed concerns about how having a child with facial differences might affect their social standing and whether people would judge them or assume there was something genetically wrong with our family. They'd essentially given up my brother because they were embarrassed by his medical condition and worried about what other people would think. I've been struggling with whether to reach out to my brother or leave the situation alone. Part of me wants to connect with him and apologize for our parents' decision, but another part of me worries that contacting him might disrupt his life or force him to confront painful truths about why he was given up for adoption. I can't look at my parents the same way anymore. Every time they talk about family being the most important thing, or when they make comments about other people not properly caring for their children, I think about how they abandoned my brother because he wasn't perfect enough for them. That story is over. The calculated coldness of making a pros and cons list about which baby to keep is absolutely chilling. These parents didn't just give up a child due to circumstances. They specifically chose to keep the easier child while discarding the one who needed more support. The fact that they kept secret updates for 25 years makes it even more cruel because they knew exactly what they were missing and chose to maintain the lie. This person's entire identity as an only child was built on their parents' shameful decision to abandon their disabled son. Let's move on to our next confession, which comes from someone who discovered their neighbour's disturbing hobby. I live in a quiet suburban neighbourhood where everyone keeps to themselves, which is exactly how I like it. My next-door neighbour Vincent has always seemed harmless enough. He's in his 60s, retired, and spends most of his time working in his meticulously maintained garden. We'd exchange polite waves and occasional small talk about the weather, nothing more. About 6 months ago, I started noticing that Vincent would spend hours every evening sitting on his back porch with what looked like a notepad, just watching the neighbourhood. I figured he was probably just enjoying the sunset or planning his garden, so I didn't think much of it. But then I realised he was specifically watching my house. Every time I looked out my kitchen window, there he was, pen in hand, staring directly at my property. When I'd wave, he'd quickly look away and pretend to be writing something else. The behaviour escalated when I started receiving anonymous letters in my mailbox. They were typed on plain white paper and contained incredibly detailed observations about my daily routine. Things like what time I left for work, what I wore, what groceries I brought home, and even what shows I watched based on the flickering light from my television. The letters weren't threatening, just unnaturally observant. They'd mention things like how I always checked my phone exactly 3 times while walking to my car, or how I had a habit of adjusting my rearview mirror twice before backing out of my driveway. I installed a security camera and caught Vincent in the act of placing letters in my mailbox at 2 a.m. When I confronted him about it, he seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset. Vincent explained that he'd been documenting the behavioural patterns of everyone in the neighbourhood as part of what he called his anthropological research project. He said retirement had left him bored, and he'd become fascinated by human habits and routines. He invited me into his house to show me his research, and what I found was deeply unsettling. Vincent had converted his entire dining room into a surveillance command centre. The walls were covered with detailed charts tracking the daily activities of every household on our street. He had colour-coded schedules showing when each family left for work, school, and errands. He documented our shopping patterns, social visits, and even tracked our garbage disposal habits. He knew which families ordered takeout most frequently, who had the most visitors, and which houses had lights on latest at night. But the most disturbing part was his prediction charts. Based on months of observation, Vincent had created graphs forecasting future behaviour patterns for each household. He'd calculated probability percentages for things like when families would go on vacation, when couples might have arguments based on body language he'd observed, and even when he thought certain neighbours might be planning to move. Vincent had detailed psychological profiles for every person he'd observed. He'd noted things like how different family members reacted to stress, which children seemed to have behavioural issues, and which adults displayed signs of depression or anxiety based on their posture and movement patterns. He showed me a thick binder dedicated entirely to my household. He documented not just my routines, but had developed theories about my personality, relationship status, career satisfaction, and mental health based purely on external observations. Vincent had even created what he called intervention scenarios, detailed plans for how he might approach different neighbours if he noticed signs that they needed help or support. He'd mapped out conversation strategies and had prepared care packages tailored to each person's perceived needs. When I asked why he was doing all of this, Vincent said he'd always been interested in human behaviour and felt like he was conducting valuable research that could help him better understand and assist his community members. He seemed genuinely confused when I explained that surveilling your neighbours and documenting their private lives without consent was inappropriate and invasive. He kept insisting that he was trying to be a better neighbour by understanding everyone's needs and patterns. Vincent promised to stop the letters and surveillance, but I later discovered he'd simply become more discreet about his observations. He'd switched to using binoculars from inside his house and had started keeping his documentation in coded notebooks. The whole experience has made me paranoid about my own privacy and has changed how I feel about living in this neighbourhood. I can't shake the feeling that Vincent is still watching and analysing everything I do, just more carefully now. That story is over. The transformation of an entire dining room into a neighbourhood surveillance headquarters is genuinely disturbing. Vincent created psychological profiles of his neighbours, like he was running some kind of behavioural analysis laboratory. The fact that he had prediction charts and intervention scenarios shows this went way beyond casual nosiness into full-blown stalking territory. Some people really convince themselves that their invasive behaviour is actually helpful research. Here's our next story from someone who uncovered a family secret that explains years of confusing behaviour. My grandmother passed away last month at 93, and while cleaning out her house, I discovered something that has completely rewritten my understanding of my family's history. My grandmother was always known for being incredibly organised and detail-oriented, so finding boxes of meticulously kept records wasn't surprising. What was surprising was what those records contained. I found a locked filing cabinet in her bedroom closet that required a locksmith to open. Inside were folders containing detailed documentation of a secret she'd been keeping for over 40 years. My grandmother had been systematically stealing small amounts of money from every store she visited since 1982. Not large amounts, usually just a few dollars here and there, but she'd been doing it consistently for decades and keeping precise records of every theft. The documentation was incredibly thorough. She had spreadsheets listing the date, store name, method of theft, amount stolen, and what she'd used the money for. She'd developed different techniques for different types of stores and had refined her methods over the years to avoid detection. But here's the part that really shocked me. She wasn't stealing because she needed the money. My grandmother was financially comfortable and could have easily afforded everything she stole. According to her notes, she'd started stealing as a way to cope with depression after my grandfather's death and had continued because it gave her a sense of excitement and control. The records showed that she'd stolen an estimated $37,000 over 4 decades. She'd kept detailed maps of which stores she'd hit and how frequently, making sure never to steal from the same place too often to avoid creating patterns that might be noticed. My grandmother had even developed a complex justification system for her thefts. She'd written lengthy journal entries explaining that large corporations had too much money anyway, and that her small thefts were essentially a form of wealth redistribution that didn't actually hurt anyone. But the most disturbing discovery was that she'd been training other elderly people in her social circle to steal using her methods. She'd created what she called a shopping club for widows in her apartment complex, teaching them techniques for shoplifting groceries and small items. The group had been operating for over 15 years, with my grandmother as the leader. She'd developed training materials, practice scenarios, and even had regular meetings where members would share their successes and discuss new techniques. My grandmother kept detailed records of each member's progress, tracking their theft amounts, preferred stores, and areas where they needed improvement. She'd created a point system and had even awarded small prizes for the most successful thieves each month. Reading through her journals, it became clear that this wasn't just about the money or even the thrill. My grandmother had created an entire community around shoplifting, giving lonely elderly women a sense of purpose, excitement, and belonging that they couldn't find elsewhere. The group had developed their own language, inside jokes and traditions around their stealing activities. They'd celebrate successful heists with special dinners and had created elaborate cover stories to explain their activities to family members. My grandmother had even written what appeared to be a manual for elderly shoplifting, complete with diagrams, safety tips, and psychological strategies for avoiding suspicion. She'd planned to pass this knowledge on to future generations of her theft ring. When I shared this discovery with my family, it explained so many things that had seemed odd about my grandmother's behaviour over the years. Her insistence on shopping alone, her detailed knowledge of store layouts and security systems, and her mysterious social club activities that she was always vague about describing. My cousins and I are now faced with the moral dilemma of whether we should report this to authorities or let it die with my grandmother. Several members of her theft ring are still alive and potentially still active, but they're all elderly women who might not survive the stress of legal consequences. We've also discovered that my grandmother had been setting aside money from her thefts to create a college fund for her great-grandchildren. The irony is that she was stealing money to pay for their education, genuinely believing she was helping secure their futures. That story is over. A grandmother running a decades-long shoplifting operation with detailed training manuals and monthly performance reviews is like something out of a crime comedy. The fact that she turned theft into a social activity for lonely widows adds this twisted layer of community building around criminal behaviour. Finding out your sweet grandmother was actually the leader of an elderly theft ring would completely shatter your perception of who she was as a person. Let's dive into another confession that shows how one person's obsession can spiral completely out of control. I need to confess something that I've been hiding for 3 years, and I'm not sure if what I've been doing makes me a hero or a stalker. It started innocently enough, but it's evolved into something that consumes my entire life and has probably crossed every legal and ethical boundary imaginable. 3 years ago, I was walking home from work when I witnessed a hit-and-run accident. A teenage girl was crossing the street when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her, then sped away without stopping. I called an ambulance and stayed with her until paramedics arrived, but she was unconscious and badly injured. The girl, whose name I later learned was Sophia, spent 2 months in the hospital recovering from multiple fractures and a traumatic brain injury. The driver was never caught because I couldn't get a clear look at the license plate, and there were no other witnesses. I felt incredibly guilty about not being able to provide better information to help catch the person responsible. I started visiting Sophia in the hospital, initially just to check on her recovery and see if she remembered anything about the accident. Her family was grateful for my help and welcomed my visits. Sophia had some memory issues from her head injury and didn't remember the accident at all. Her parents mentioned that she was struggling with depression and anxiety as a result of her trauma, and that having visitors seemed to help her mood. What started as occasional hospital visits turned into a daily routine. I would stop by every day after work, sometimes bringing books or magazines, sometimes just sitting with her when she had trouble sleeping. Her family started treating me like an honorary relative, but after Sophia was discharged from the hospital, my involvement in her life should have ended. Instead, it intensified. I convinced myself that I had a responsibility to help her recovery and make sure she stayed safe. I started following her to physical therapy appointments, not to interact with her, but just to make sure she arrived safely and that no one was bothering her. I told myself I was being protective because she was still vulnerable from her injuries. The following escalated gradually. I began tracking her daily routine, when she left for appointments, which routes she took, where she stopped for errands. I convinced myself that I was conducting informal security surveillance to make sure she wasn't in danger. I started taking photos of anyone who interacted with Sophia, building files on her friends, family members, and medical providers. I told myself I was documenting potential threats or people who might take advantage of her condition. Within 6 months, I had compiled detailed dossiers on everyone in Sophia's life. I knew their work schedules, their relationships, their financial situations, and their personal histories. I'd convinced myself that this information was necessary to protect her from people who might want to hurt her. I began interfering in her relationships when I decided certain people were bad influences. I would anonymously contact employers, landlords, or family members of people I thought were harmful to Sophia's recovery, sharing information designed to create problems for them. I convinced myself that I was protecting her by eliminating negative influences from her life. When her boyfriend started pressuring her to move in with him before I thought she was ready, I anonymously sent his employer evidence of him stealing office supplies, which got him fired. When a friend was encouraging Sophia to go out drinking, which I felt was dangerous given her medication, I reported the friend to her probation officer for violating the terms of her DUI sentence. I created fake social media accounts to monitor Sophia's online activity and the activities of everyone around her. I would report any concerning posts or comments to appropriate authorities if I felt they represented threats to her well-being. My apartment became a command center filled with photos, timelines, and detailed charts tracking every aspect of Sophia's life and the lives of everyone around her. I had maps showing her daily routes, schedules of all her appointments, and profiles of every person she encountered regularly. I convinced myself that I was providing better protection than any official agency could offer because I understood her specific situation and vulnerabilities. I felt like I was her guardian angel, watching over her and eliminating threats before they could cause harm. The situation reached a breaking point when Sophia started dating someone new. I decided this person was dangerous based on my background research and began planning to eliminate them from her life permanently. I'd been escalating my interventions and was prepared to take more drastic action when I realized what I'd become. Looking at my apartment filled with surveillance equipment and detailed plans for manipulating someone's life, I understood that I'd turned into exactly the kind of person I thought I was protecting Sophia from. I've been trying to step back from my involvement in her life, but it's incredibly difficult. I know everything about her daily routine, her problems, her relationships. I feel like I'm abandoning my responsibility to keep her safe. Sophia has no idea that I've been monitoring and controlling her life for 3 years. She thinks I'm just the good Samaritan who helped her after the accident and occasionally checks in on her recovery. That story is over. This person transformed from a helpful witness into a full-blown stalker, orchestrating someone's entire life from the shadows. The way they justified destroying people's careers and relationships as protection shows how completely warped their thinking became. Sophia has been living in a controlled environment for 3 years without realizing that someone has been manipulating every aspect of her existence. This is genuinely terrifying because it shows how someone can convince themselves that stalking and control are actually acts of love and protection. Our next story comes from someone who made a discovery about their spouse that changes everything. They thought they knew about their marriage. I've been married to my husband Daniel for 12 years, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about him. He's always been a creature of habit, same morning routine, same breakfast, same route to work every day. Daniel works as an accountant at a mid-sized firm and has always been incredibly predictable and reliable. That predictability was actually one of the things I loved most about him when we were dating. But 6 months ago, Daniel started acting differently. Nothing dramatic, just small changes that I initially attributed to work stress or getting older. He began staying up later, claiming he was having trouble sleeping. He started going for long walks in the evening saying he needed the exercise. He even bought new clothes, which was completely out of character for someone who had worn the same style of khakis and polo shirts for over a decade. The changes were subtle enough that I didn't really worry about them. If anything, I was happy to see Daniel trying new things and breaking out of his rigid routine. I encouraged the evening walks and complimented his new wardrobe choices. But then I started noticing that Daniel was receiving packages almost daily. When I asked about them, he'd say they were work supplies or things he'd ordered online that he'd forgotten about. He'd quickly take them to his home office, and I wouldn't see them again. Daniel's home office has always been his private space, and I've always respected that boundary. He keeps it locked when he's not using it, saying it helps him maintain work-life separation. I never questioned this arrangement because it seemed reasonable. Last month, Daniel had to go out of town for a business conference, and he forgot to lock his office door. I went in to water the plant on his windowsill and discovered something that has completely shattered my understanding of who my husband is. The entire office had been converted into what looked like a professional art studio. There were easels, canvases, professional-grade paints, brushes, and lighting equipment everywhere. The walls were covered with dozens of paintings, beautiful, sophisticated artwork that demonstrated incredible skill and artistic vision. But here's what really shocked me. Every single painting was a portrait of me. Not just simple portraits, but incredibly detailed, intimate paintings showing me in various settings and emotional states. Some showed me sleeping, others captured me laughing or reading or cooking. The level of detail and artistry was museum quality. I found sketchbooks filled with hundreds of drawings of me from every angle and in every possible situation. Daniel had been documenting my life through art for what appeared to be years. There were paintings of me from our wedding day, from vacations I'd forgotten we'd taken, from quiet moments at home when I thought no one was paying attention. The most unsettling discovery was a series of paintings showing me in locations and situations I didn't remember. Daniel had apparently been painting me from memory or imagination, creating scenes of me in places we'd never been together or doing things I'd never done. In one corner of the room, I found journals where Daniel had written detailed descriptions of each painting, explaining what he was trying to capture about my personality or emotional state. The writing was incredibly romantic and poetic, describing me in ways that were both beautiful and slightly obsessive. Daniel had apparently been taking art classes for the past 5 years, telling me he was working late or attending work events. He'd been living this entire secret creative life, centered entirely around studying and depicting me through his artwork. The packages I'd been seeing were art supplies, instructional materials, and canvases. Daniel had been building this secret studio piece by piece, creating what amounted to a shrine dedicated to capturing every aspect of my existence through his artistic interpretation. When Daniel returned from his business trip, I confronted him about the discovery. He was mortified and embarrassed, explaining that he'd started taking art classes as a way to deal with stress, but had become obsessed with trying to capture the beauty he saw in me every day. He said he'd kept it secret because he was afraid I'd think it was creepy or obsessive. He claimed the art was his way of expressing love that he couldn't put into words, and that creating these paintings made him feel closer to me even when we were in the same room. Daniel begged me not to be upset, explaining that every painting was created out of love and admiration. He said he'd been planning to eventually share his artwork with me, but wanted to become skilled enough that I'd be impressed rather than concerned about his amateur attempts. The revelation has left me completely confused about how to feel. On one hand, the artwork is genuinely beautiful and clearly represents years of dedication and love. On the other hand, the secrecy and obsessive focus on documenting my every movement and expression feels invasive and unsettling. And I keep thinking about all the times over the past 5 years when Daniel claimed to be working late or attending business events, when he was actually studying my face and creating detailed artistic interpretations of my daily life. It feels like he's been living with a version of me that exists only in his imagination and artwork. The most confusing part is that the paintings show me in ways I've never seen myself. Daniel's artistic interpretation makes me look more beautiful, more interesting, more complex than I feel in real life. It's like he's been creating an idealized version of me and falling in love with that creation rather than the actual person. Daniel has offered to stop painting and get rid of all the artwork if it makes me uncomfortable, but part of me is fascinated by seeing myself through his eyes and curious about this secret talent he's been developing. I just don't know if I can get past the years of deception and the slightly obsessive nature of his artistic focus. That story is over. The idea that your husband has been secretly painting museum-quality portraits of you for 5 years is both incredibly romantic and deeply unsettling. Daniel essentially created an entire alternate identity as an artist while living a double life centered around documenting his wife's existence. The fact that he painted her in situations she didn't remember suggests he'd been studying her so intensely that he could recreate her essence from pure imagination. It's like discovering you've been married to a stranger who happens to be completely obsessed with you. Here's our next confession from someone who discovered their co-worker's bizarre method of handling workplace stress. I work in a high-pressure marketing agency where everyone deals with stress differently. Some people smoke, others exercise, a few drink too much coffee. But my cubicle neighbour, Patricia, has developed the strangest coping mechanism I've ever witnessed, and I accidentally discovered it last week when I stayed late to finish a project. Patricia is 52 years old and has worked at our company for almost 15 years. She's always been known as extremely professional and competent, handling even the most difficult clients with grace and efficiency. She never seems rattled by deadlines or angry customers, which I've always admired. But around 6 months ago, I started noticing that Patricia would disappear for exactly 15 minutes every day at 3:30 in the afternoon. She'd leave her desk, walk toward the bathroom area, and return exactly 15 minutes later, looking refreshed and calm. I initially assumed she was taking smoke breaks or making personal phone calls, but Patricia doesn't smoke and rarely uses her phone during work hours. When I asked her about it casually, she just said she needed some air and changed the subject. Last Tuesday, I was working late on a client presentation when I heard strange noises coming from the supply closet near Patricia's desk. It sounded like someone was having a conversation, but I could only hear one voice speaking in hushed, rapid tones. My curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly approached the supply closet. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Patricia inside, surrounded by office supplies, having what appeared to be an intense conversation with herself. But she wasn't just talking to herself randomly. Patricia had created an elaborate scenario where she was conducting a therapy session, playing both the role of therapist and patient. She'd set up 2 chairs facing each other and was alternating between them, having a complete psychological consultation with herself. I watched in fascination as Patricia would sit in one chair and discuss her work stress, relationship problems, and personal anxieties in detail. Then she'd move to the other chair and respond as a professional therapist, offering advice, asking probing questions, and providing emotional support to herself. The conversations were incredibly sophisticated and therapeutic. Patricia had apparently studied psychology enough to conduct legitimate therapy sessions, complete with proper techniques for exploring emotions and developing coping strategies. She'd created different voices and personalities for her therapist character versus her patient character. The therapist, Patricia, was calm, professional, and insightful, while the patient, Patricia, was more vulnerable and open about her fears and frustrations. During these sessions, Patricia would work through specific workplace conflicts, analysing her responses and developing strategies for handling difficult situations. She'd discuss her relationships with co-workers, her concerns about job security, and her personal goals and aspirations. The most impressive part was that she'd keep detailed notes during these sessions, writing down insights and action plans that she'd apparently implement in her daily work life. She had a whole filing system for tracking her progress on different issues she'd discussed during her self-therapy sessions. I realised that Patricia's remarkable composure and problem-solving abilities at work were the direct result of these daily therapy sessions she was conducting with herself. She was essentially providing herself with professional-level psychological support every single day. After discovering this, I started paying closer attention to Patricia's work performance, and I noticed that she would often implement specific strategies or approaches that she'd probably developed during her supply closet therapy sessions. When dealing with difficult clients, she'd use communication techniques that seemed too sophisticated to be improvised. When mediating conflicts between team members, she'd ask exactly the right questions to get people to examine their own motivations and find common ground. Patricia had essentially become her own therapist, and it was making her one of the most emotionally intelligent and effective employees in our entire company. She'd figured out how to provide herself with the psychological support that most people get from professional counselling or close friends. I've been debating whether to say anything to Patricia about what I witnessed. Part of me is impressed by her innovative approach to self-care and mental health management. Another part of me wonders if she's aware of how unusual her coping mechanism is. The supply closet therapy sessions have clearly been beneficial for Patricia's professional performance and personal well-being. She's found a way to process stress and develop solutions without involving anyone else or taking time away from her work responsibilities. I've actually started wondering if I should try something similar, because Patricia's approach to handling workplace stress is obviously more effective than anything the rest of us are doing. That story is over. Patricia turning a supply closet into her personal therapy office is actually kind of genius in the most bizarre way possible. The fact that she developed sophisticated therapeutic techniques and essentially became her own licensed counsellor shows incredible resourcefulness. While it's definitely unconventional, her method is clearly working better than whatever stress management the rest of the office is using. Sometimes the strangest solutions are the most effective ones. Let's move on to a confession from someone who discovered their elderly neighbour's secret nighttime activities. I live in a quiet residential neighbourhood where most people are in bed by 10 o'clock. My next-door neighbour, Mr. Chen, is 87 years old and seems like a typical retiree who spends his days gardening and reading on his front porch. But over the past few months, I've discovered that Mr. Chen has been leading a completely different life after dark. It started when I began having trouble sleeping due to work stress. I'd often be awake at midnight or later, and I started noticing that Mr. Chen's house would have lights on at all hours. Initially, I assumed he was having trouble sleeping too, which wouldn't be unusual for someone his age. But then I started seeing Mr. Chen leaving his house at 1 or 2 in the morning, dressed in all black clothing and carrying what looked like a large backpack. He'd walk quickly down the street and disappear into the darkness, only to return several hours later, just before sunrise. This happened every single night for weeks. Mr. Chen would leave around midnight and return between 4 and 5 in the morning, always carrying the mysterious backpack and always dressed like he was trying to avoid being seen. My curiosity eventually got the better of me, and I decided to follow him one night to see where he was going. I felt guilty about spying on an elderly neighbour, but his behaviour was so unusual that I convinced myself I was just making sure he was safe. Mr. Chen walked about 6 blocks to the downtown area and entered an alley behind a row of shops and restaurants. I watched from a distance as he began what appeared to be a systematic search through dumpsters and garbage containers. But this wasn't typical dumpster diving for food or recyclables. Mr. Chen had a methodical approach, using a small flashlight to carefully examine discarded items and sorting them into different categories in his backpack. Over the course of 3 hours, I watched Mr. Chen visit over 20 different locations, spending considerable time at each dumpster and making careful selections of specific items. He seemed to know exactly what he was looking for and had obviously planned his route in advance. When Mr. Chen returned home, I waited a few days before casually striking up a conversation about his evening activities. I mentioned that I'd noticed his lights on late and asked if he was having trouble sleeping. Mr. Chen seemed hesitant at first, but eventually opened up about what he'd been doing. He explained that he'd been collecting discarded electronics, small appliances, and other items that businesses throw away, then repairing them in his garage workshop. He showed me his garage, which had been converted into an impressive repair facility with tools, testing equipment, and workbenches covered with various electronic devices in different stages of restoration. Mr. Chen had apparently been a skilled electronics technician before retiring, and he'd been using his expertise to repair hundreds of items that he'd rescued from dumpsters. His garage was filled with working televisions, radios, small appliances, and computer equipment that he'd completely refurbished. But here's the part that really amazed me. Mr. Chen had been quietly distributing these repaired items to low-income families in the community. He'd established relationships with local churches, community centres, and social service agencies, providing them with refurbished electronics for families who couldn't afford to buy new items. Over the past 2 years, Mr. Chen had single-handedly rescued and repaired over 3,000 electronic devices, creating a one-man recycling and redistribution operation that was helping hundreds of families while keeping tons of electronic waste out of landfills. He'd been doing all of this work completely anonymously, never seeking recognition or credit for his efforts. The organizations he worked with knew him only as someone who occasionally dropped off boxes of working electronics, with notes explaining that they were donations for families in need. Mr. Chen explained that his nighttime schedule was necessary because businesses typically put out their trash after closing, and he wanted to get to the discarded items before garbage trucks picked them up. He'd mapped out the most efficient routes and had developed relationships with cleaning crews, who would sometimes set aside items they thought he might be able to repair. The scale of his operation was incredible. Mr. Chen had detailed records of every item he'd collected, repaired, and distributed. He'd created a system for testing and categorizing different types of electronics, and he'd even developed relationships with parts suppliers who would sell him components at cost for his charitable work. What started as a way to stay busy in retirement had evolved into a significant community service operation that was making a real difference in people's lives. Mr. Chen was essentially running a professional electronics repair business out of his garage, except everything he fixed was given away for free. He asked me to keep his activities secret because he didn't want attention or recognition. He said the work was its own reward, and he enjoyed feeling useful and productive in his retirement years. Since learning about Mr. Chen's nighttime activities, I've gained incredible respect for his dedication and ingenuity. He's found a way to use his skills and experience to make a meaningful impact on his community while addressing environmental concerns about electronic waste. That story's over. Mr. Chen running a secret midnight electronics rescue operation is absolutely incredible. The fact that he's been silently repairing thousands of devices and redistributing them to families in need makes him like a technological Robin Hood. His dedication to doing this work anonymously shows he's genuinely motivated by helping others rather than seeking recognition. This 87-year-old man is probably doing more for his community than most people half his age. Our final story comes from someone who made a shocking discovery about their roommate's mysterious daily routine. I've been living with my roommate Kevin for about 10 months, and I thought I had a pretty good understanding of his schedule and habits. Kevin works remotely as a software developer, so he's usually home most of the day working from his bedroom office. He's quiet, clean, and generally an ideal roommate who pays his bills on time and doesn't cause any problems. But Kevin has one habit that I've found increasingly puzzling. Every single day, at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, he leaves the apartment and doesn't return for exactly 3 hours. He's never missed this appointment in the entire time I've known him, regardless of weather, workload, or other commitments. When I've asked Kevin about his daily outings, he's always been vague, saying he has appointments or errands to run. He never provides specific details about where he goes or what he does during these 3-hour absences. Kevin's punctuality about this daily routine is almost robotic. I've tested it by engaging him in conversation at 2:10, and he'll politely but firmly end the conversation and leave exactly at 2:15. He's never been even a minute late leaving or returning. Last week, my curiosity finally got the better of me, and I decided to follow Kevin to see where he goes every day. I felt guilty about spying on my roommate, but his mysterious behaviour had become so intriguing that I couldn't resist. Kevin walked about 8 blocks to a large public park and made his way to a specific bench near a pond. He sat down, pulled out a notebook and pen, and began what appeared to be detailed observations of the people and activities around him. For the next 3 hours, Kevin systematically documented everything he observed in the park. He recorded the number of people who walked by, their approximate ages and descriptions, what activities they were engaged in, and even details about their interactions with each other. Kevin had developed an elaborate coding system for categorizing different types of park visitors and activities. He would make quick notes using abbreviations and symbols that allowed him to capture large amounts of information efficiently. But this wasn't casual people watching. Kevin's observations were incredibly detailed and systematic. He would track the same individuals if they stayed in the park for extended periods, noting changes in their behavior, interactions, and activities over time. I watched Kevin for several days, and his routine never varied. He would arrive at exactly the same time, sit on the same bench, and conduct the same type of detailed behavioral observations for exactly 3 hours before returning home. When I finally confronted Kevin about what I'd witnessed, he was initially embarrassed and defensive. He explained that he'd been conducting what he called social research to better understand human behaviour and social interactions. Kevin revealed that he'd been struggling with social anxiety and difficulty reading social cues throughout his life. He'd started his park observations as a way to study normal social behaviour and learn how people interact in casual, unstructured environments. Over the course of 2 years, Kevin had filled dozens of notebooks with detailed observations about human behaviour patterns. He'd identified recurring social dynamics, documented seasonal changes in park usage, and developed theories about how different types of people interacted with their environment. Kevin had essentially created his own anthropology research project, using the park as his laboratory for studying human social behaviour. He'd been treating his daily observations like a graduate-level field study, complete with hypothesis testing and data analysis. He showed me some of his notebooks, and the level of detail was incredible. Kevin had documented thousands of social interactions, identified patterns in group behaviour, and even developed predictive models for how certain types of social situations would unfold. Kevin explained that his research had actually helped him become more comfortable in social situations. By studying how other people navigated conversations, handled conflicts, and formed connections, he'd learned social skills that didn't come naturally to him. He'd been using his observations to practice social interactions in low-stakes environments, gradually building confidence in his ability to read social cues and respond appropriately in various situations. Kevin's daily park research had become so important to his personal development that he'd structured his entire work schedule around protecting those 3 hours for field observations. He asked me not to tell anyone about his research project because he was embarrassed about needing to study social behaviour so systematically. He felt like most people learned these skills naturally and wouldn't understand why he needed such an analytical approach to human interaction. Since learning about Kevin's research project, I've gained a new appreciation for his dedication to personal growth and his innovative approach to overcoming social anxiety. His methodical study of human behavior has clearly helped him develop social skills that he might never have acquired otherwise. That story is over. Kevin turning a public park into his personal social behavior laboratory is actually brilliant in the most endearing way. The fact that he's been conducting legitimate anthropological research to overcome social anxiety shows incredible determination and creativity. His systematic approach to learning social skills might seem unusual, but it's clearly working better than traditional methods. Sometimes the most analytical minds find the most innovative solutions to human problems. If you enjoyed this batch of Reddit stories, there's more where that came from. Consider subscribing for more just like these, as I read and post videos just like this every day. Thank you for watching, and see you tomorrow.